What's good, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to the channel. I'm Lotus Asakura, the one who never knows best, and today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about fighting games and have a discussion on whether modern fighting games are more skill-based or luck-based. Now, to some of you, there may be a very obvious answer to this question, but I think it'll make for a bit of an interesting discussion, especially after a tweet I saw that gained a decent amount of traction from a very prolific fighting game player who I'm sure the majority of you are very familiar with. And this tweet comes to us from Punk. You know, Punk the God, the Street Fighter 6 player. Well, he's a Street Fighter player in general, fighting game player in general, predominantly known for Street Fighter, but he's really good at a multitude of games. And he put out a tweet earlier this morning that reads, "I feel like Tekken has to be the last fighting game where being better than someone actually matters anymore. Every other fighting game is just about getting your opponent in a guessing situation and possibly winning off of it, no matter the skill difference." And I thought this was pretty interesting. And I guess to give a little bit of context, it's worth noting that this tweet comes the day after he lost in a big Street Fighter tournament to a young talented player by the name of Paladin. So there's obviously some salt that is still left over from that loss in this tweet. But I feel like I scrolled very briefly through some of the replies to the quote tweets just to kind of get the vibe of, you know, how people felt about this and see where the community lied when it came to this opinion or this topic. And there were, as you probably would imagine, a lot of people who were like discounting or discrediting it entirely just because they're like, man, you just mad because you lost, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, of course, like, sure, this was made in a little bit of salt after his loss in the tournament, whatever the case may be. But I don't think that should, mean that we just completely overlook what he's saying here and just write it off because like, oh, this is just a salty tweet. Because I do think there is some truth to it. And I do think that he makes somewhat a valid point that I kind of disagree with. And there are obviously some parts that I don't necessarily agree with. But let's go ahead and talk about it a little bit. Now, this subject isn't new. This is something that we've talked about before. I don't know if I've ever made a dedicated video about it, but it's something that has come up in my videos, in the past, whether it's just me while I'm playing a ranked game or whatever the case may be. But to some degree, it does feel like, fighting games aren't as much about a difference in skill as they may have been in the past. But I don't know if there's really any truth to that or if that's just how it feels, because there's always been BS in fighting games. There's always been guessing in fighting games. There's always been mix-ups and Oki and everything like that, right? Which is where you're actually guessing. But let's just go ahead and talk about it piece by piece. Let me pull the tweet back up, and he says, "It feels like Tekken has to be the last fighting game where being better than someone actually matters anymore." And this is obviously relevant or topical because we just got the close of the final Tekken World Tour for Tekken 7. The World Tour for that game finally came to a close. Arslan Ash has been crowned the champion and cemented himself as the most skilled, the most dominant, and the most decorated Tekken 7 player by far, hands down. So big congratulations to him first and foremost, and shout out to him for his Tekken 7 run, because what he did is something that nobody else was able to do in that game. I mean, he's a 4-time EVO champion, 2 times for EVO Vegas, 2 times for EVO Japan. He's the only player that has won an EVO and a TWT event. He won Combo Breaker a couple of times and other events along the way. And he's just, what he did is incredible. And, he deserves it. He works hard, he trains hard, he plays hard, and he showed that he is just the most skilled player at the game. And Punk probably saw this as well, and that's kind of what probably led him to this conclusion, right? And he goes on to say, every other fighting game is just about getting your opponent in a guessing situation and possibly winning off of it, no matter the skill difference. And it feels like these days in a lot of games, there's a lot of mix-up and a lot of RPS. RPS especially, it seems like something that's very prevalent in games today, and it's something that's always been around, but some games lean into it more heavily than others. Quickly, if you don't know what RPS means, it's just short for rock, paper, scissors, where essentially there's a situation in a game where you're guessing between these options. Both players are essentially guessing. So in the same way that, rock beats scissors, scissors beat paper, paper beats rock, you have options in fighting games where it's like, say for example, attacks beat throws, throws beat blocking, and blocking beats attacks, right? And so obviously there are more situations and more nuanced situations or specific situations that come up in fighting games. But it seems that like not only do those RPS situations come up a lot more in fighting games, and I'm sorry, I feel like I'm repeating myself a little bit and sounding a bit redundant, but not only do those come up a lot more in fighting games, but like they're more frequent, and how you get to them also is like easier, you know what I'm saying? Because neutral skips and whatnot, which we'll talk a little bit about later, but I digress. Let me get back to the point. Now, he says that he feels like Tekken is the last fighting game where being better than someone actually matters anymore because there's probably like less RPS and less BS, and Tekken is like slower, more methodical. It is, a game where you have to know frame data and matchups, and you have to play neutral a certain way and pokes and everything like that. And something that's very popular, like a term that's getting thrown around a lot these days in fighting games, is neutral skip, right? It feels like, every month there's like a new term that the FGC catches on to, and then gets thrown around and people hear it for the first time and then run it into the ground, right? Whether it's neutral skip, whether it's saying something like, oh, I gapped him, or this person got gapped. Or like, I remember for a short time in DBFZ, people were like obsessed with the idea of an install because they found out what an install was for the first time because of fighters, and was like, I know more characters have install, right? And it's feel like there's always like this new term or phrase that gets coined and thrown around a lot, and neutral skip is one of them. And I would say that for the most part, I don't personally feel like Tekken is a game that has a lot of neutral skips. The funny part about that is that a lot of things that people probably value and appreciate in Tekken, whether it be in Tekken 7 or older titles, is going to change in Tekken 8, largely due to the heat mechanic, among other factors as well. But Tekken 8 seems like one of those games that is going to try to cater more toward a casual fan base, try to have more accessibility to beginner players, and so on and so forth. And so it's funny because this opinion might not be something that he has if he's somebody who attempts to get into Tekken 8. He'll be like, never mind, the things that I thought were cool or dope about this game no longer applies. And I still think Tekken 8 is going to be an incredible game. It's a game that I'm very much looking forward to. I'm very excited about. And there's a lot of things that I think are going to be absolutely amazing about the game, and maybe the best that any Tekken game has ever been. You know what I mean? And only time will really tell. And hopefully that stays true, because I'm really excited about, for that game. But even in Tekken 7, I would say that there are, as with anything, exceptions to the rule being that it's more traditional, it's more methodical, it's slower, etc., etc. In fact, Arslan Ash, while he ended up winning the final match of the event with Katarina, which was a shock to everyone, not because we're surprised that he can play Katarina, but it's just not the character you would expect at a grand final of the biggest event for the final tournament of this game, you know what I'm saying? But yeah, he played a lot of Kunimitsu. And Kunimitsu is a character who kind of breaks that traditional Tekken mold and breaks some of the rules, and that's a reason why a lot of people don't like her. Now, personally, I play the character, I like her. I think aesthetically, she's really, really cool. I love her design. I love her moveset. It's a really dope, like, pretty ninja girl. Like, of course, you know what I'm saying? That's me all day, you know what I'm saying? The fox mask, everything, I rock with that, right? But despite her cool design or the lore, the moveset, or whatever, there's a lot of people who don't like her for multiple reasons. One of the most popular reasons being the fact that she's just very strong, and as with any fighting game, people are going to tend to dislike the characters who are strong, because people always hate the top tiers, right? Unless you play that character, you tend to hate them. You know, that's just how it goes. But also, she's a character who's very heavily focused and built around mix-ups and making your opponent guess. And that's not something that we really see a whole lot traditionally in Tekken, right? There's normally not a whole lot of like guesswork and mix-ups in it. Now, that's not to say that mix-ups don't exist, because of course they do. And even in Tekken 7, like, a lot of characters have mix-ups when it comes like to their rage drive or just having certain plus frames or whatever. It's a lot more about the pokes, the neutrals, block punishing, whiff punishing, things like that, which are the things people claim that they value in fighting games a lot, even though I don't know if that's necessarily the case in people, how people truly feel. But it is what people say, right? People want more footsies, they want more neutral, they want less neutral skips, and so on and so forth. And Tekken is one of those games that, until Tekken 8, doesn't really have a whole lot of that extra fluff, or like the simplified stuff that people aren't really feeling right now. But Tekken 7 is far from a perfect game, and I'm sure Tekken 8 won't be perfect either. But when you have characters like Akuma and Geese Howard on top of characters like Kunimitsu, yeah, the Tekken players definitely had their fair share of like, we don't fuck with this at all. This isn't Tekken. This isn't real Tekken. We don't like this. This doesn't belong in the game. This is breaking the mold. This is like, people can just pick up this character and go willy-nilly. And you know what I'm saying? That definitely existed. Like, we've been talking about 2D characters in Tekken for quite some time. You know, basically since their incarnation in the game. Akuma was never really liked because he was like broken at the very start. They nerfed him quite a bit. And then it turned out that he was still really broken. Everybody just didn't know it until a few years ago. And he's been dominant ever since. And Geese Howard has been ridiculous since his launch as well. And it has also been nerfed, but it's still very, very powerful. So you have Tekken characters and non-Tekken characters who kind of were dominant in the game, much to people's, what's the word I'm looking for? Distress, chagrin, something along those lines. You know what I'm trying to say, right? A lot of people weren't big fans of that. And I'm personally of the belief that more of that is going to exist in Tekken 8. But we'll see. But I definitely get where he's coming from, because if you look at Guilty Gear Strive, if you look at Grand Blue Fantasy vs. Rising, games that I enjoy, games that I think are really good, Street Fighter 6, they all have these like neutral skip things where people can just kind of wild out, be more YOLO, get huge reward on just gambling heavily. And you know, when I sit down to think about it, and you can feel free to disagree, and like I said, this is a discussion video, so I'm not trying to convince anybody to agree with my opinion. I'm just giving kind of my thoughts, and I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts in the comment section down below as well. But Tekken does feel, in comparison to these games, like a game that is less about constant gambling, constant mix-ups, constant guessing, and like I said, more so actually having more knowledge and skill than your opponent. Now, with that being said, Tekken 7 is also much older than some of these games. You might even be able to say that it's not an old game per se, but Tekken 7 originally released in arcades in 2015 and then on console in 2017, right? So it's a 9-year-old game or 7-year-old, depending on how you want to look at it. But either way, when we're comparing it to these other games, you know, these games have been out since, let's say like Strive and then forward. Strive came out like what, 2019. Street Fighter 6 just came out last year. Grand Blue Fantasy Versus Rising just came out a couple months ago, so on and so forth. And while the game has been updated throughout the years, it's about to get its actual like modern or most recent installment here in just a couple of weeks. And it seems to me like the things that people disliked the most in Tekken 7 were the things that kind of broke that. And honestly, I am someone that does share the opinion that a lot of games today, they have the agenda of trying to make it so that anybody can win. And I think Dragon Ball FighterZ is another game that's a big example of this, where the actual like motive behind the game, where the design philosophy behind the game is to make it not only accessible, but put players in a state where even a lower skilled player can be a higher skilled player. Now, before we go further into that point, with that being said, while I do have the opinion that this is kind of the trend or the direction for modern fighting games, I do still believe that the majority of the time, the more skilled player should and does win. There is a reason why at the highest level of games, you still see consistency among the top players. You very rarely see these anomalies where some player who wasn't that good picks up a certain character or a certain team or whatever and suddenly starts dominating, right? You rarely see these players who like you wouldn't necessarily consider good at games suddenly become a top player. There's a reason for that, because at the end of the day, fighting games are hard. They do take skill, they do take, you know, practice and knowledge and everything like that. And while at some levels you might see a certain player pick up a character and do better than they would have before, it doesn't necessarily translate to you going from somebody who would be like an 0-2 player to like making a top 8 at a major. But having said that, it does feel as though the skill gap has shrunk a little bit, and that there are more times now where a lower level player or a less skilled player can and does in fact win, and that is 100% by design. Like I do truly believe developers are by design making it easier for players to somehow luck out or, you know, kind of flail their way to victory more often than it was in the past. And again, like there's always been fighting games that are full of BS. Marvel had a ton of BS. Older Street Fighter games have had their own BS. So I'm not trying to say like, oh, back in my day we had good old honest footsies and neutrals and fighting games took skill back in my day. But like, I almost feel like this one point in particular can't even be argued, that fighting games are trying to dedicate the games more to casuals. Like that is as an active point that they are trying to make, something that they're actively trying to do with the release of these titles. And they do try to shorten the skill gap, and they're not completely, sorry, I kind of smacked my mic there. I was moving my hands around a lot while I was talking, but they're not completely erasing or eliminating like skill and practice and knowledge from the games. But they are trying to make it so that it's not as big of a requirement to win constantly as I feel like it may have been before. Yeah, I don't know. There's also something to be said about fighting games and how how do I explain? Fighting games, they come full circle, right? And I feel like a lot of things in life are obviously this way. But I saw a tweet that I believe was from SQ where it was like, you know, at a low level, fighting games are like, oh, my opponent's just mashing and guessing. And at a high, and then like at an intermediate level, it's like, okay, I've done the lab work on this. I know this setup. I know this situation. I have a punish for this, etc. So, you know what I'm saying? I need to do this string, or I back that shit, you know what I'm saying? And then at the high level, it's like, oh my God, this person is just mashing and flailing. And it's funny because it's true, right? And that's the case in fighting games. That's the case in other things in life. And, you know, even when it comes to like specific mechanics or moves or whatever, like something I said before about Dragon Ball FighterZ is the exact same thing, where it's like at a low level, Super Dash is broken. Then at somewhat of a competent level, Super Dash is useless because all players are doing is standing around hoping that you Super Dash so they can 2H. And at a high level again, Super Dash is broken. You know what I'm saying? And that's just something that you could apply to like a lot of mechanics in fighting games or just fighting games in general. It's like my opponent is just mashing and flailing. And then it's like, okay, you know, we're playing some neutral. I got these punishes, da-da-da. At the high level, it goes back to my opponent is mashing and flailing, because that's kind of what the game rewards to a certain degree, right? When you get to a certain level in fighting games, you start just doing things wildly and randomly, because like, oh, okay, I'm learning the nuance behind this and like the pros and cons to doing this. And I don't want to be too risky because like, you know, I've learned more, I've improved more, and I want to be more methodical in my play. And then when you reach the next level, you're like, man, this shit is broken. I'm gonna just spam this move, or like this mechanic is fucking stupid. I'm just gonna abuse it. You know what I'm saying? And that's where things get kind of funny and kind of silly. But I don't know. I thought it was an interesting tweet. I thought it would make for interesting discussion. I don't want to drag this video out too long, because even though I probably have a lot more thoughts that I didn't cover, I feel like since I didn't write things down, I'm just doing it off the top of my head. I'll just start rambling and talking in circles. But yeah, I think fighting games still do require obviously thought, skill, precision, being better than your opponent. But that gap has shrunk, and there are definitely more times and more cases where a higher level player can lose to a lower level or a less skilled player, because the game rewards them for doing things that may or may not necessarily be the smart thing to do. And then you can come back and argue and say, well, if they won, then it was a smart thing to do. You know what I'm saying? That's a whole other can of worms, because I know like there was another conversation that was going around where somebody said something to the effect of fighting game players be like, oh, I was punished for doing the right thing. And that's probably something I've said something similar before as well, right? And I kind of want to get into a little bit, but it could damn near be its own separate video. But like the idea of like, let's just say, for example, I'm in a situation, right, where I read my opponent wants to do a DP, right? So on my Oki, I safe jump. I'm like, this person's about to DP. They do a miss input and accidentally grab me and I die. They wanted to DP. So like I did have the right read on what they wanted to do, but I was wrong and I got punished for sitting there and blocking because they accidentally did a throw instead of their DP, right? And that's the type of situation that does happen sometimes. So it's like, well, was I right or was I wrong? And on one hand, you can make the argument that I was right because I did correctly read my opponent. I did what should have been the right thing. But you could also say, well, no, you were wrong because they didn't DP. They did a throw. And it's like, but they did that by mistake. And it's like, okay, well, whether accidental or on purpose, the fact remains that this is the outcome and this is what happened and the facts are the facts. And so you were wrong because and that's why you lost. And it's like, you know, I think that's, I don't know if I necessarily call it like a philosophical thing or a difference in perspective or what. I don't really know, or if I believe there's a right or wrong answer there as to whether you are right or wrong in that situation. But I do think it makes for an interesting discussion. Yeah, there's just little things like this that I see come up on Twitter from time to time, and I have thoughts about. And you know, sometimes I just want to talk about it a little bit. And if this is something that you guys would like to see me do more of, then feel free to let me know in the comments down below, and I can just pick out some of these topics from time to time. We can just have these discussions. It's something I think I have done, but I don't do it as often as I probably could, right? So I guess the point to take away from all this, and basically the camp where I lie, is that Tekken is probably, in comparison to a lot of games out right now, a more traditional fighting game, or a bit more honest. But robberies absolutely happen in that game. That game absolutely has BS. It has mix-ups. It has a lot of guessing. There is RPS, you know what I'm saying? But it probably is more prevalent in other games than it is in Tekken. But Tekken 8 might change that to a degree, so I don't know how much that opinion will hold up. But at the end of the day, whether games are catering more towards luck or guessing, or if skill still matters, skill does matter. And there's a reason for top players being so consistent. I mean, Punk himself is an example of that. Even though he may from time to time lose to a player who you might not necessarily say is better than him, players are not perfect, right? There's going to be days where they have misinputs, or the execution is just a little bit off, or somebody just has a better day and they just, you know, they're doing everything right, or, you know what I'm saying? And it just happens. And, you know, it just happens. The better player does not always win, but they usually win. Even if it does feel like at times in certain games these days, it might feel like they don't win as often as they should or normally would. Should is probably a strong word to use in that, because that is, you know what I'm saying? But like, hopefully I'm getting my point across and you understand what I mean. But with that said, I think that's a good place to end things off. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. I would love to hear guys' opinions on this. Hit this video with a like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already so you can stay tuned for all the awesome content that I'm bringing you. And with all that being said, that's pretty much all I have today. And remember, just can happen and see you swing the bat. Later.